This might be the most important video you watch this year because there are threats coming at you from every angle. Threats to your business, to your health, to your relationships, to your future. And everyone talks about resilience and grit. But what if the real problem is that you've been conditioned to survive instead of conditioned to be effective against your challenges and threats? So before we dive into this idea of how to be dangerous, let's quickly talk about its polar opposite. So to do that, I need to take you back a few years. I was in a coaching session working with a very successful executive, and I saw a very weird picture in front of me. On the one hand, this guy was doing really well. There was no reason to feel sorry for him. He was loved by his team, his family, his company was doing very well. But then there was just something kind of off about the picture. And what was off was that internally, he was in survival mode. Now, we all go through survival mode from time to time. You might even be there right now. Survival mode has three characteristics that you might be able to identify. The first is that when you're in survival mode, you become reactive. You go through your day just putting out fires. You don't really care about change or transformation or being proactive. The second thing is that you operate from a place of fear, frustration, and anxiety. And the third thing is that you do the same things over and over. What you do in survival mode keeps you in survival mode. And so what was quite jarring for me was that this guy was doing really well in life, and so I couldn't figure out how he ended up in survival mode. I spent weeks thinking about this. And then one day, a word just jumped out at me. And that word was harmless. I realized that if I had to describe him, I would say that he'd become pretty harmless. There was just no edge to him. There was no bite to him. And so we got into our next session and I said to him, listen, I want to share something with you. I think you've become pretty harmless. And he said, well, that's actually exactly how I feel. Like that nails it on the head. So we spent the session talking about what it means to be harmless and how that led to him being in survival mode. And the aha moment for us was that he did a lot of things that made him very successful. And when he became successful, he took his foot off the gas. He stopped investing in his own growth. It dulled his senses. It dulled his skills. And so he slowly backslid into survival mode. So it became quite apparent for us how we actually ended up in the situation. But we went through the session, and by the end I said to him, well, we can't stay here. We've identified where we are. We spoke about survival mode, about being harmless, but we can't stay here. So if you are not going to be harmless, then what will you be instead? And he said to me, I want to be dangerous again. And the moment he said that to me, I immediately knew what that meant. Internally, I just felt it straight away. And many of you watching this video will immediately feel that feeling, like you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you that don't, we often use this term in sports. For example, we might say LeBron James is dangerous. And when we say that, we don't mean that he's going to actually go out and physically hurt people. What we mean by that is that he is very formidable in his domain, that he is great at what he does, that he should not be underestimated, that he is of consequence. When we are harmless, we often feel inconsequential to the forces that are shaping our lives. Whereas when we become dangerous, we take back some of that power. We step back into control and we feel like we are directing our own fate. We are not to be underestimated. We are a force to be reckoned with, and we are formidable in our own domains. Ultimately, I spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean for us to be dangerous? And this is where I finally landed. Every single day in your life, there are threats that you have to deal with. This is not a pessimistic thing to say. This is just reality. It's the way that life is. And how you respond to these threats really matter. Now, sometimes you are going to be ineffective against the threat because you don't have what it takes to overcome the threat or overcome that challenge. And when that happens, you can only be its victim. And when you are the victim, you end up in survival mode. But there is an alternative. And the alternative is you get to be a threat to the threat. You get to be a danger to the danger. And when you are able to do this, you are able to achieve your goal. You are able to reach your destination. You reap the reward. And so here are three shifts that you need to make if you're going to go from harmless and being in survival mode to being a threat to the threat to being dangerous. The first shift is you need to name your reality. Most people don't even realize that they are in survival mode. And the reason for that is that survival mode's most potent weapon is its invisibility, that we get stuck in this pattern and we don't even realize that we are in it. And so it can take us a very long time just to get to the point where we go, oh, I actually feel pretty stuck. There are also some people who know that they are in survival mode, but they just don't want to admit it to themselves, because when you have to look in the mirror and acknowledge to yourself that you are in survival mode, it's a pretty tough thing to do. And the reason why it's a tough thing to do is because you are complicit in creating that situation. There's a great question from an executive coach called Jerry Colonna that goes, how am I complicit in creating that which I say I don't want? This really shines the spotlight on the fact that we are complicit, that we have done certain things, we have been ineffective in our lives to a certain extent, and as a result, we have ended up in survival mode. This is a very tough thing to do, but it's a very necessary first step. There's a psychiatrist by the name of Dan Siegel who deals with patients who've had severe trauma in their lives. And he said that his entire body of work, all of his research, can be summarized with one phrase: name it to tame it. And that is exactly what we need to do if we are to move beyond survival mode and move beyond being harmless. We have to name it to tame it. What I always suggest people do is to start off with a very broad reflection on where they are. And so what you might do is to imagine a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being harmless and in survival mode, 10 being I'm feeling pretty dangerous. And just ask yourself, where do I feel like I fall on this scale at the moment? And you might find that you are pretty low on the scale. And if that's the case, that's okay. We all go in and out of survival mode. It's okay to be in survival mode. It's just not okay to stay there. So you need to do something about it. And if you are higher on the scale, then that's great. Hopefully this video helps you to be even more dangerous, but always be honest with yourself. Sometimes if we give ourselves a high score initially and we reflect on it a bit more, that score might start coming down a little bit. But so the very first step, if we are to be more dangerous, is that we need to acknowledge where we are. The second shift is that we need to identify our real threats. Now, again, this is something we often turn a blind eye to because we don't like staring at our challenges. We don't like staring at threats. But of course, they exist. And if you ignore them, the only place that'll lead to is survival mode, because you won't prepare for the threat. You won't deal with the threat. And so you'll be outdone by it. A few weeks ago, I was at the paddle court speaking to someone about their business. And specifically, we spoke about how they are utilizing AI. And to my surprise, when I asked them, how are you using AI in your business? They said, we aren't. And I said, but why not? And the guy said to me, well, it actually just makes me nervous. And I realized that, oh, he's still very nervous about AI taking his job. And so as a result, he's just ignoring it. But of course, if you ignore the threat, it just becomes bigger and bigger over time, and it becomes much harder to deal with. And so the realization here, and this is a truth across all threats, is that there's an external threat and an internal threat. The external threat, for example, is AI that is rapidly advancing, that is able to infiltrate industries, that might be able to take your job. And so you need to do something for the external threat. But there's also an internal threat, and that is that you aren't adequately dealing with the fear, the frustration, the anxiety that comes with changes, that comes with threats and challenges. This step, however, is really important because when a threat is vague, we don't really know what to do with it. When it's vague, it feels quite overwhelming. It feels like it infiltrates every single area of our lives. Whereas when we are able to accurately identify the things that are challenging to us, that are threatening to us, then we can be more specific in how we address it. This brings us to the third shift, which is to become a threat to the threat. Now, this is the question I get asked all the time, is that, okay, so I've identified that I'm in survival mode. I've identified the threats and the challenges that are in front of me. How do I become a threat to the threat? And people expect that I'm going to give them a very specific answer here. But to be honest, you know how to become a threat to the threat. You can figure it out. In fact, that's the excitement of the third step, is that you get to step into the role of strategist in your own life, to look at the threat and to ask yourself, which steps do I need to put in place in order to overcome this challenge or this threat? And what you'll find is that there are 3 areas that you need to focus on. The first is that you need to focus on how you are thinking about the threat, because sometimes our thinking becomes skewed. You might overthink it and think, oh, well, this is way bigger than it actually is. Or you might think, well, it's not such a big deal. I can deal with it a bit later. You need to accurately assess the threat, and then you need to be very clear in your thinking about how to deal with it, how to strategize and plan to deal with that threat. And you might often find that engaging in coaching or speaking to other people might help you to clarify your thinking about certain threats and challenges. The second area that you need to consider is the emotional aspect of dealing with a threat or a challenge. As I've said before, it creates in us a certain level of fear, frustration, and anxiety, which very easily paralyzes us from taking action. There are two distortions that you are likely to experience. It's called the distortion of probability and the distortion of severity. The distortion of probability says things are likely to go wrong, and the distortion of severity says when it goes wrong, it's going to be catastrophic. And so you can imagine that when these two are on repeat in your mind, then all of a sudden it becomes very difficult to take action because you are constantly just feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed by these emotions. And so the key here is emotional regulation. The third area that you'll need to pay attention to is just taking action, the execution part of it. What you might often find here is that you aren't taking enough action, like you aren't taking big enough action, or that the action that you're taking is ineffective because you don't have the skill you need. And so what that tells you is that you need to go and learn new skills. You need to go and invest time and effort to become the kind of person who can overcome that threat or that challenge. I wish I could just tell you, do this, this, and that, and all of a sudden you'll be successful against all of your threats. But the reality is that we all face different threats at different times and different contexts. And so the most important thing that I can really tell you is that you need to name survival mode, that you need to name your threats. And from that space of honesty, that space of pure reflection, now I believe with everything in me that you have the ability to strategize how you should approach those threats and those challenges, that you'll be able to see how to overcome it, and then to also see the gap, meaning how do I need to change how I'm thinking, feeling, and acting so I can overcome the threat or the challenge. The biggest gift from this book, what this idea gave to me, is the accountability that we have to be a threat to the threat. And that every single day I can simply ask this question, am I being dangerous? Am I being a threat to the threat? And it's a very clear yes or no. And if the answer is yes, I keep going. And if the answer is no, I know something needs to change. I'll tell you quite honestly that I don't think you need to buy the book to get the benefit of this idea. What I've covered in this video will put you on the right path. The most important thing you can do is to cultivate the honesty, to name it if you are in survival mode, to identify your threats, and then to be strategic, to be committed, to be convicted in dealing with your threats and in becoming a threat to the threat.